The following podcast is a presentation of Project Entertainment Network.
Okay, guys, welcome back to the Horror Academic, and this month is going to be a real special edition because I have a guest, virtually, of course, because, we can't go anywhere. He can't either, so he get nothing better to do but to be on my show today. So, Anthony, why don't you introduce yourself to the crowd?
The internet. Hey, academics. My name is Anthony Derington. I'm the founder of Something Ghoulish. And Victoria is actually a wonderful contributor on our site. We kind of do these interesting deep dives into genre films, horror, sci-fi, kaiju, through podcasts, editorials, and videos. Great.
And you should definitely check out somethingghoulish.com's content. A lot of great stuff up there from many people. And a lot of interesting topics for discussion. So I am happy to be part of the Ghoulish family.
We're happy to have you on board.
Cool. He might just be saying that because he's on my show this time. So.
Oh, no.
So I thought we should hit one of the real great classics. And probably, to me, there's very few perfect movies out there in the world. And I would probably say maybe like Ghostbusters and Jaws are, to me, the perfect movies. So let's tackle Jaws today. So Jaws, just for a quick background, you may or may not remember or know, was based on the Benchley novel. This was a huge hit. This was summer reading all over the world, actually. Huge hit in America, big enough for Universal to option the rights to make the movie and to pick a fledgling director, a newbie, as it were, to make that adaptation. And that newbie, Steven Spielberg. Hard to think of him as a new kid on the block, but he totally was when Jaws came out. A little bit about Spielberg at that time. So he had done a couple of TV movies, episodes for a few shows, and he had done one feature film called Sugarland Express in '74, which had kind of, mixed reaction. Didn't really change the world. But Jaws, on the other hand, I think we can say is a film that definitely changed the way movies happened after it. Let's talk a little bit about Jaws as a genre film. Anthony,
yeah.
Let me get your input on this. How do you feel about the idea of, is Jaws a horror movie?
Absolutely. I think people have had this conversation for a while and it's always kind of like a fun thing to talk about within genre fans, is it a horror film? Is it not? One of the things I always like to start throwing into the mix now is Jurassic Park, a horror film, which, I feel like Jurassic Park is a very apt comparison of a film because it still kind of has these similar tonal shifts to Jaws. You have these very overtly horrific moments, and then you have these other moments where they're like, it's adventurous and familial and wondrous. I think the two films pair very well, just when it comes to at least tone and what genre are they maybe primarily in. And I think Jaws overtly is a horror film, at least in the way it was shot. And we know after the fact that the way it was shot was by consequence the issues they had, on set. But because of that, it's almost like Jaws is pretty much like a slasher film if you just replace the slasher with a shark.
It's an interesting weapon of choice. I tend to think of it as a monster movie, and I think maybe we don't tend to picture many monster movies where the monsters are real monsters,
Right.
Usually we think monster movies, they're kind of aliens from outer space, or, mutated creatures or, some sort of mythical thing. But sharks are real. Sharks actually exist. They're even prehistoric in nature, like Jurassic Park tie-in.
Right.
And I think both movies, they play with our idea of what a monster is because these are things that actually have lived or live on the planet with us. So yeah, I think we're somewhere in between those two places. I do see the slasher motifs as well. It definitely plays with your anticipation, and we'll talk definitely about how the music does that for quite a bit of it. Let's see now. The thing that's, if we want to talk also about why Jaws is important. So, one reason I would definitely say Jaws is important is the impact it had at the box office. It is known as the first summer blockbuster. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this was maybe one of the, like, there have obviously been films before where us as a collective have gone out and flocked to see it. But I think like maybe in the 70s we got into the real like American movie culture. You kind of like have the tail end of old Hollywood, and then you have more audiences that are not just going to see a movie to pass the time, but see it as like a collective, as a community. And that's existed time and time again, but it's been more of like it evolved into the blockbuster culture that we've seen before. It wasn't until the 1960s that people really started going and showing up at movie times when they were supposed to. People were just kind of going in and out whenever. And so you have at least a decade later with Jaws where not only people are showing up, but they're showing up because of the marketing and because of the hype. And I think because of that, that's something that has perpetuated the big summer blockbuster of Fast and Furious or Marvel films or whatever. So at least in the culture part of Jaws, I think that is a pinpoint you could put it on.
Yeah. And I also think a lot of why it kind of took off in that way as a blockbuster is because it didn't really just appeal to genre fans. It appealed
Right.
to everyone. I mean, that's one of those movies, like you said, like it's the American movie. Everybody saw Jaws, and a lot of people saw Jaws more than once. So that was
Right.
another kind of phenomena at the time. And it definitely had a lot of, like, instantly affected kind of the zeitgeist of the community of America of,
Right.
there was the don't go to the beaches because Jaws is there. Like it
Right.
scared people away, and it had a huge impact, and probably one of the quickest impacts that we could see in a movie in America.
One thing that me and my friend Chris, who hosts on GargantuCast, we talk about often, that
Hi,
Spielberg is
Chris.
kind of this master of turning like B movie plots into like full blockbusters. Because like going back to the Jurassic Park comparison, you look at that and that's like very much a B movie plot,
Yeah.
but for whatever reason he's able to make it work. And same thing with Jaws. It's a Moby Dick story. But it's something that everyone can relate to. And like, oh, it's a killer shark. That sounds silly to a certain degree. But for whatever reason, the killer shark is not the focus.
Right.
And I think maybe that's where a lot of films later down the line kind of miss their mark with doing their own interpretation or own story. It's the characters. It's Hooper, it's Quinn, it's Brody. It's those three that really sell the film.
Definitely. I mean, this is definitely a character story film, and I mean, maybe that's why many people don't particularly think of it as a genre film, because they spend so much time creating characters that we really come to know and really care about.
Right.
And all the best horror movies really do that anyway. But I think maybe from outside the genre, people don't look at horror that way. But I think it's a
Right.
great example of that. And I mean, it's probably like the classic male bonding story, I'm sure, of all time. These three guys end up on a boat and tell stories about their scars. But
Right.
but it creates one of the greatest movie moments in our modern history, because that moment, and we were talking a little bit before we started recording, that moment when people see it, it does stop you, and you pay attention, you fall into those stories, and you want to hear these guys, and
Right.
it makes you that much more endeared to them because you care if they live or die.
Right.
Yeah.
We were talking about Quint's in praise of the villain speech. It's something in screenwriting that is something that's done often to kind of show the severity of the threat that the characters are facing. You can find it in Halloween, you know, with Loomis talking about Michael, as he had the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes, you know. And his USS Indianapolis speech is a prime example of in praise of the villain. And it's giving me goosebumps now, like thinking about it, you know, because it immediately grabs your attention. And I think a lot of people maybe don't necessarily like immediately think about the storytelling in Jaws, or at least in filmmaking in general, because the film medium is already a storytelling medium. So telling stories within that, I think like almost that's like the secret recipe in Jaws, right? That's the thing that like makes everything feel real. Because, you know, as we're talking or you're talking with friends, like you share stories. That's how people in general communicate, whether you realize how often you do it or not. And I think being able to create that own lore, that own lived in realness of these people and their experiences is fundamental to the success of the film.
Yeah. I mean, that idea of it's almost like a campfire story time.
Right.
You think of like I recently rewatched The Howling, and that's a great movie to kind of showcase the ability to sit around a fire and tell scary stories. But even the way Jaws starts is a campfire scene with a bunch of college kids who are home for the holidays, having a party, and, you know, sitting around a campfire, just hanging out, talking, drinking some beer, and playing a little guitar. And of course, that leads to the first victim. But it's those really familiar sequences. And what I love also, not just our main characters that we have these deep dives into within the story, but the little characters around the town. Martha's Vineyard is like completely, or you know, Amity is completely inhabited in this film. Everybody's got a name. They're not just background characters. Everybody knows each other. All the fishermen at the dock, all the people on the beach. Yeah. And those environments are so full that they become real. And it's a great thing that Spielberg does in this.
Right. And it's also like the really small interactions too that build on that, you know, that like in the very beginning, like Brody is trying to figure out what's going on with the shark. And then in the process of that, he's kind of being pestered with all these small town grievances, like, oh, the karate students are karateing my fence, you know? And it's like, you know, obviously like Amity has nothing to worry about, you know? So it's also like a really interesting storytelling device where it's like, it's showing you the stakes of what this town has to deal with, but it's also kind of giving you a little bit of what the people are like too, you know?
Yep. I mean, another film that does that great, and you know, maybe not something that comes to mind quickly, but Nightmare on Elm Street has this wonderful mechanism of showing that there's this boogeyman already existing in their culture. When the girls first talk about their nightmares, it's the phrase "it's a real 1-2, Freddy's coming for you" is already part of their vernacular, and that's something that puts you instantly in a mindset in a world that is lived in. That karate chopping, I love that. That's like, you know, the kids in town are menaces, and you know, the guys at the dock are all fighting for each other to be the guy who brings in the shark because they want that reward.
Right.
You know?
Or even like immediately when Hooper shows up, you know, he's trying to get Brody, he's like scrambling on the dock. It's very like it's kind of like pairing these wonderful awkward human moments as well, you know, because people stumble and they're not perfect and they can't always like stand up to challenge, or especially when you're talking about like machismo or like your atypical man character, right? And so like Hooper on the dock is kind of like a dork, and he's like, you know, he has a spine, but he's like, he knows when to stop at least. But you know, he gets frustrated, you know, that he tries to tell the people, oh, you're overloading your boat, and you know, they basically tell him to leave, screw off. And he's like, they're all gonna die, you know, and he's like talking under his breath, and he does that the entire film. And while Brody's trying to be like the middleman, and even Brody, you know, he pulls on the strings and all the stuff falls over on the boat. You get these little awkward snippets because that's how people are, you know, people are fumble and they trip and they're not perfect and they can't always stand up to challenge, you know, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. Let's talk about Hopper a little bit, because or Hooper, sorry. The when you first see Hooper, in the beginning of the scene that you're talking about, he comes off of his little boat onto the dock, and a guy helps him up, one of the dock hands, and you instantly have this kind of huge guy, and Hooper's this little kind of squirrely dude, like, hi. So it already shows that he's not gonna really compete with these guys in some macho way.
Right.
He's kind of the intellectual of the group. He's there as the scientist. He's going to be the one to tell them the actual facts about sharks. And probably one of the greatest interactions is it's I believe the next day, where they thought they found a shark, but it's the wrong shark.
Right.
And Hooper first really kind of has his introduction to the mayor of the town. The
Right.
mayor is one of the great villains. I think he is more the villain of this piece than the actual shark, because the mayor is we're going to keep the beaches open because it's 4th of July and it's our livelihood.
Right.
And Hooper's trying to tell him, yeah, this is the size of the shark. There's the billboard that had been vandalized, and he's trying to tell them, no, these kids are pretty close to the mark. This is a big fish, and it's going to kill everybody.
Mhm.
And I love that the mayor is like, oh, you'd love to prove that so you can get yourself into the National Geographic. And Hooper just kind of like,
There's no
I
way.
don't, yeah, I can't help it. This guy's not going to listen to me. So
Right.
those interactions too, I think really sum up kind of the story really well. One of the things I wanted to mention is that thinking of the mayor in the town and his kind of stance, and kind of which seems to be the kind of the general council of the town, saying we have to save the summer season, we have to, this is our livelihood, this is when we get our business, their resort town. That's based on, and there's eventually, when he wrote the book, he was in some way basing this on the actual shark attack of 1916 in New Jersey that took place down towards Atlantic City, and over 12 days, I believe, the shark hit various spots along the Jersey
Oh, wow.
shore.
Okay.
And I wanted to mention that because there was a great little documentary about it I had picked up a while ago when I first got my Blu-ray player, this kind of Shark Week greatest hits
Okay.
that's out there from Discovery, but it has a good documentary called Blood in the Water that I recommend if anybody's interested in learning more about that. But so Blood in the Water is a story of the shark attack in 1916, and it was literally like the municipalities saying, well, we can't close the beaches because this is the shore, and this is the resort towns, and we need the money. And literally, like, I believe 4 people died because of this shark. So it's interesting to see how he didn't place the story in New Jersey, but he did kind of another area that made a lot of sense for the story to take place in, the Martha Vineyard area, the made-up town of Amity. But so the book kind of, I think, because it also harked on something that was true, could kind of, maybe a lot of people could relate because, oh yeah, I heard about that, or I read about that. That's another thing
Right.
that gives relatability. But I think really between the book and the movie, at least in America, there's this kind of shark fear that came out of it that isn't particularly as warranted, I think, as became. Sharks are pretty rare in the waters, and they like to stay away from people. So
Right.
it's interesting how, whenever the movie would kind of resurface, or sequels, there would this shark fear would kind of pop up again in pop culture as well. So it's another way that Jaws had an interesting impact. Um,
Yeah, I'd
would you?
love to at some point kind of do some type of deep dive into, I guess, the like biological or environmental effects of Jaws.
Mhm.
And that might be something for us to kind of take a look at later on.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Um, let's talk a little bit about the making of the movie. One of the things, starting off, is that the book is a little different. The book is not quite
Right.
as in depth into the characters. It's a little bit more of almost at times, a romance novel.
Right.
It's like I said, it was a big hit, but reading it a couple years back, I was a little surprised at the actual source material wasn't quite as in depth on these characters, and that
Right.
proves how much of the writing changed. And it was more buying the property so that they could write the stories.
Right.
Um, but one of the things about it, and probably a lot of this also had to do with Spielberg, knowing that essentially his career was on the line. He had to make a big impact to get Universal to keep him on board with this project. But there's mechanical effects that I'm sure if you know anything about Jaws, you know that the mechanical shark was named Bruce, and Bruce was not their best actor. He didn't perform well quite a few times and would break down on a regular basis. So they were kind of also dealing with this very much in real time, and every day they were literally spending the nights doing rewrites.
Right.
So the film went over budget. It went over time. It was fraught with mistakes and problems. And also, you know, we have this big, huge hemorrhaging money mechanical effect. So there's lots of great stuff on the documentaries that go further into that. But I think we should just, you know, any other things we should add to that, you think, Anthony?
Yeah. So like, we talked a little bit earlier about it, but I had friends over the other evening, and so we watched Jaws together. And so we talked a little bit about the mechanical effects. And so a lot of that was the shark Bruce, it wasn't built for saltwater. It just wasn't. Yep. And so once that information was disclosed later on, the engineers were like, you can't put this in the ocean. Like, it's not going to work. So that was also part of the fault too. It was partially filmed in the ocean and partially filmed on like a Universal pool backlot. Yeah. And I also believe too that they had to build 3 sharks, I think. Yeah. So because the shark couldn't turn, it could only go forward, right, and left.
I think there was also like partial sharks too. Like I think there was like a shark head prop that was used, and there's definitely parts. I mean, it's not quite as dramatic as say like in Ed Wood they talk about how they forgot the mechanical parts for the octopus when they're making Bride of the Monster, and Bela Lugosi has to make the octopus work, which is a great scene. But it wasn't quite that bad. But yeah, the mechanical parts of it wouldn't really always be on target. So they found workarounds. They would use parts of the of the prop to kind of make the scenes work, and they would also do workarounds. But there was a lot of time spent waiting for things to work, which is not uncommon, especially back in the 70s, making a big, huge budget film with lots of effects. So pre-CG, yeah. And I think there are some moments where you can almost kind of see like the jaw connection part bits for the mouth. Yeah. But I think overall the shark still looks good. And when we finished Jaws with my friends that we were watching it with, they genuinely said like, this film still holds up. And I think that's kind of like, even the longevity of some of the hit or miss practical effects, I think that contribution, and even saying that so many years later, is an indication of, that they went in the right direction. Oh yeah, and if nothing else, I mean, particularly the first time you watch it, you don't see these flaws. Right. You just see what seems to be a real shark at some times. I mean, there's also some mixture with some actual footage, I believe, of sharks of different types, but but it's even with all the problems, it's definitely a great case for physical effects and the impact they can have on an audience. And it's maybe, I mean, I know I tend to watch this movie maybe like once a year, kind of in the summer. Yeah. And the more you watch it, the more you watch it, the more you see the flaws. But it is probably maybe one of the first films that's really kind of famous for the kind of behind the scenes trials and tribulations.
Right. I know there's a wonderful podcast series I highly recommend from Wondery. It's Mark Ramsey. He does the Inside series. And so one of his most recent ones is Inside Jaws. And he kind of does like this audio drama story of like the production of a film and like what happened along the way. And one of the things detailed in his audio documentary is like Spielberg had severe anxiety on set. And they were doing rewrites daily. And apparently, I don't know like what the full extent of this, but apparently Spielberg would put celery under his pillow to help him sleep.
Interesting.
Um, like apparently something about the smell or the feeling, or I guess his mom used to do it for him, but that was the only thing that would get him to fall asleep. And he was doing the rewrites at Martha's Vineyard when they were filming. So he had his own little house and cottage there, and they were doing rewrites daily, and then going to set and doing it.
Yeah. It's a pretty intense story. It's funny to think of, I mean, it was a fairly big budget. I mean, it's a Universal Pictures, as big as you get, but it had a very indie spirit in that way, that he was, doing this in a very grassroots style.
Right.
It was very much, seat of your pants filmmaking, even though, this was big. And
Right.
everyone in the world got to see the results.
And I think that's maybe some of the criticism with like a lot of modern blockbusters is everything feels very formulaic in a way,
Yeah.
and you don't have like oftentimes the room to just experiment, or try something else. Everything is more by the book, and so it's very interesting looking at one of the best films of all time that really wasn't that planned out. Everything was kind of played by ear.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think part of the reason that was even able to happen is because it was filmed on location. If he had done this entirely in a Universal backlot, especially so early in his own career, he probably would have had executives and producers, on his back. But
Right.
there's benefits of filming on location. You're
Right.
away from it, and you're in your own. I mean, many people who film on location will say it's like that is your world for that period, and they really could become, the story they were making. And
I heard that Romero was very similar in that way too, and that's why he filmed a lot in Pittsburgh.
yeah, well, that was a literal community, and this was
Yeah.
a kind of like I guess you could say that they brought so much with them to Martha's Vineyard to make Jaws that they created their community, which is very common, I'd say, for location shooting.
Right.
But one of the things that I also want to talk about, and you can't think about Jaws and not discuss, is the iconic music.
Right.
And I think musically, this movie had a huge impact. I think people know the kind of like those 2-note score
Right.
long before they even see the film. It's now it's a Williams score, John Williams, who of course scored tons of everything big, huge, famous, right? I mean, he's Star Wars, he's Indiana Jones, he's all the big stories of our time.
Mm-hmm.
But Jaws is probably one of the first ones that I think caught on as much as it did. Williams had done, like Spielberg, he had started doing lots of television. He was doing TV movie scores. He even scored, it's a weird little history of TV note, he scored the Heidi movie that preempted the Super Bowl. So not the best thing to have on his record, but a little bit of history there. But really, I think the things that put him on the map were he had done Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, there's Towering Inferno, like all those big, huge Universal disaster movies, and that was a huge genre at the time. And I think that's probably where he got a lot of the cred needed to be kind of on this big of a scale.
Mm-hmm.
And he had also done Sugarland Express, which we had said was Spielberg's first film, and that's where they first met.
Okay, so they already had a relationship at that point.
Yeah, I think they were both kind of just Universal guys who were working together a lot. And when it came time to do Jaws, Spielberg specifically said he wanted to have Williams on the project.
Okay.
So,
Nice. Yeah, that shows the power of a score. When you like, you could probably be, I don't know, maybe like a kid right now who's probably 10 years old, and if you just made the dun 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 dun, like for whatever reason, like that's just entered like cultural osmosis, and it's just been absorbed by everyone. Even like the whole Psycho sting. If you hold your hand up and make that noise, like people immediately know what you're talking about. And that just shows the power of their music compared with the imagery of when it's presented.
Yeah. And I mean, really, when you think of how how Jaws affected kind of the pop culture world and zeitgeist of America, that's probably number one on the list, is how the music affected us. And it definitely affected the way music was used in films after it.
Right.
I know a small thing I would do when I was teaching was to there's certain films I would play a sequence without the music and then play it again with the music. And you see, like if you watch the beginning of Jaws where the girl is swimming and we only know that she's in danger because of the music. So when you
Right.
watch that sequence without the music, it really nothing's happening. It's no big deal. It's just kind of, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
Once you put the music in there, once that really creates an element of fear. But
Right.
I think the other thing also to remind people is that this is John Williams before Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
So Jaws is 75, Star Wars is 77. So this was the monumental score, I think, of his career at that time. And if not, top 5, top 2, maybe even.
Yeah, it was definitely something that he probably put at the top of his resume and was like, this is the full extent of my ability, and obviously becoming such a hit of like film Americana, and like John Williams, I feel like for the most part probably became like a household name, which like and I guess that's kind of also the emergence of the film culture, widespread film culture we were talking about, is like no one probably knew who certain directors were or screenwriters or actors. I mean, actors were more so sold on top bill for films. And then I think Jaws was also maybe part of that segue of selling the director over who was being cast. Not as much, but still part of that.
I mean, and to be fair, maybe at first Jaws was marketed definitely based on the actors. You had,
Mhm.
I think at that time we can definitely say that Richard Dreyfuss was still kind of at the beginning of his career. I mean, he'd
Right.
made American Graffiti, but after this he makes Close Encounters, which is another Spielberg film, and that really, I think, by then, I think everyone knows who Richard Dreyfuss is.
Right.
Roy Scheider had been around a little longer. He had, I mean, French Connection, Marathon Man. So he, in 2010, a little later, he already was kind of on the scene. But really, the big thing was Quint, Robert Shaw. He was, I mean, his career started in the 40s in Britain. And he did tons of action, adventure, kind of very standard swashbuckler type stories, too. So he
Mm.
was kind of like a man's man film kind of action hero. Maybe not quite like the Stallone of the time, but
Right.
he he was very well known, and he was kind of the grab, I think, to get people in. Really, like that's another thing with the casting of Jaws, by having up and comers paired with a veteran. I
Hmm.
think that was also adding to the layer of, especially in a summer, selling it as a summer film, knowing that you would have your box office from that. But he works them very effectively together, and it's almost interesting how the kind of hierarchy of their placement as actors is similar to their hierarchy in the story, where he's the
Hmm.
veteran, he's the old timer, he knows the game, and these young guys are trying to tell him how to do it. So it kind
Right.
of pulls up. But it's definitely so those names became names making while the film is being put out there. But definitely, I think by the end we know it's a Spielberg film, and
Right.
people know this is John Williams, and not many composers become household names, and I think Williams is the number one because of all
Right.
these, thanks to people like Spielberg and Lucas and things like that.
Absolutely.
Um, so I think we could segue a little bit here now to talk about collecting Jaws a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to start off with the probably, this one's not a typical collector. Oi, a
Oh.
hefty old box here. Jaws on Laserdisc Special Edition. What's cool about this one is this is the Letterbox Signature Collection, Universal Signature Collection, but it's on 4 discs, so this thing is a monster.
Jeez.
Yes, it
That's
has a lot of
nuts.
extras. There's behind the scene documentary from '95, which I don't think is the one that made it to DVD, which is interesting.
Okay.
So this is surprisingly late in the run on Laserdiscs as well for a 95 doc. But this one actually was gifted to me by a professor I had who was getting rid of his Laserdisc collection. It originally came with the book and the CD inside, but he kept those.
Yeah, I mean, that's understandable.
Yeah. And so thanks to him for that. But yeah, so this is a cool one to have in your collection. You have something, I think, which is actually even older edition of the film, right, Anthony?
Yeah. So I have this Jaws VHS tape. I picked up from there's this used bookstore I go to all the time, and they have some wonderful picks sometimes. Sometimes where I find a lot of older VHS tapes and things like that. But yeah, it just kind of has like the wonderful cover art, just that like aqua blue. Yeah, love this so much. And it's so simple too, you know, just that like plain artwork and everything, you know, it pops.
Yep. I love how the sky and the water kind of blend even, you know, in the art. It's awesome. It's a great way to play it off. But
yeah.
And I think after that I do have the anniversary collector's edition DVD.
Okay.
Which has a lot of the features that we're going to see on the Blu-ray. So this was kind of this was one of the first DVDs I think I bought actually, because Jaws is just one of those movies I always have to have.
Right.
So if you're not a Blu-ray person and you're looking for a DVD, there's quite a few special editions out there on DVD that are worth picking up.
Right.
So which version of the Blu-ray do you have?
I think we have the same one.
Yeah, let's reveal.
Very much the same Blu-ray edition. Has the 2-hour documentary on the back, like pictures from set, deleted scenes and outtakes, the marketing of Jaws. Honestly, it has kind of like the whole package, and it has like Blu-ray and DVD for it.
Yep, and I think there's 2 documentaries of. There's the making of Jaws, which I think is the one that was on the DVD that I just showed, and then the special on this one is called "The Shark Is Still Working," which is a great title.
I love it.
So you have a 2-hour documentary and an hour and 45-minute documentary. You have 13 minutes of deleted scenes. There's an 8-minute piece on the restoration of the film, 9-minute set piece from when they were filming in 74, and then tons of like storyboards, photos, marketing materials, all that great stuff. I highly recommend. It was funny when I did get this, I think it took me a few weeks to get through all the extras. There was so much.
Oh wow.
So, you know, those feature-length documentaries kind of add up. But if you're like me, and I think like you, these are a pretty cool way to learn more about the film. Definitely anything more you can learn about Jaws is always fun. And
it's always interesting diving into like the behind the scenes or documentary bits of films that are such like classic pieces of work, because it's like obviously someone made this, but like it feels like it's always existed, right?
Yeah.
And so like getting to the origins of this like, you know, nebulous thing is always very interesting.
Yes. So very cool. The only thing I would say that they're missing on this is a commentary track, but with 2 feature-length docs, I think it's okay. We can let that one slide. What actually I did want to see. One thing I wanted to ask you about was you did a in your video essay collection, you did a piece about Jaws, about a piece of history about Jaws. You want to tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's like Jaws has like a very strange piece of like true crime history that's attached to it. So about a year before Jaws came out, while they were filming, there had been a murder in I believe somewhere near Martha's Vineyard, or maybe about 2 hours south of Martha's Vineyard, and it was this woman's body who was found on the beach, and it was very obviously a murder because you know, limbs had been severed, and her clothes and her towel were folded and placed under like her head on the beach, and some of her teeth had been removed as well to prevent identification. And so basically this happened, and there's potentially a kind of like a, not a wink and a nod because that seems inappropriate, but some type of like, I guess, gesture towards that in the beginning of the actual film, where the woman's body that's found on the beach, the first time Brody sees it, it's just like the hand with the crabs and seaweed. And so a lot of that was also kind of a very timely thing that people reacted to. That was a very region-specific case. And so it was kind of this murder mystery that had gone unsolved, and it's still unsolved. And so, flash forward to like the 20 teens at some point, the son of Stephen King, Joe Hill, was watching the Jaws, and there's a woman who appears on the on like a scene where all the tourists are leaving the boat for the first time. And the woman matches the identification of the Lady of the Dunes so closely. And so they were kind of doing research, and at that time, it wouldn't be unheard of for film sets to call in extras from locals. And so it's very possible that the Lady of the Dunes, who was murdered, was in Jaws before she was murdered. And so that's one theory that they've been trying to get going. So I kind of talk about like the filming of Jaws, the body, Joe Hill's theory, and kind of the leading investigations about it. And it's kind of like this weird true crime piece in Americana that's like kind of consistently been going on since the 70s. It's such a wild ride and a very, very large rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, it was really interesting when I saw your piece. That was the first time I'd really heard a lot about it. So I highly recommend you guys check that out. It's on Something Ghoulish's YouTube page for a little extra deep dive into the world around Jaws. So, but that's interesting stuff to check out. Also, like we mentioned, you can check out Something Ghoulish's website, somethingghoulish.com, for articles and podcasts and all that. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up for today?
I mean, I can't end the show without showing off my Jaws tattoo, right?
No, we have to.
Yeah. So, obviously, love Jaws to death. And if you love Jaws as well, there's a scene in the first town hall meeting where Quint drags his nails across the chalkboard. And on the chalkboard, there's kind of this very crude, rudimentary drawing of the shark eating someone there. And so I got that tattooed on my bicep here.
Very cool.
Yeah, that was my first tattoo, and I'm absolutely in love with it.
It's awesome. It's such a great tribute to the film, too.
Yeah, because it's one of those small things that, like, it's not overtly detailed. It's super simple, but if you know what it's from, like, you'll be happy with it immediately. Yeah.
And it forever scars you as a film aficionado and a Jaws fan too.
Yeah.
So
proud to be one.
Thank you so much for coming on with me and talking about Jaws. I know it's I think it's a movie that we both have in common as one of our favorites. So I'm glad we were able to have this chat.
Yeah, I'm glad I was able to kind of nerd out on it. We write and go through all this production of talking about films all the time, but sometimes it's nice to just have these very candid conversations and just be a fan.
Yep. And that's what the Horror Academic's all about. Talking about what movies are important, why they're important to us as fans, and, to enjoy them together as a community. So I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation too. And, hit us up with a comment, like, and share this video with other fans of Jaws. Thanks a lot, and Horror Academic is out.
podcast where 3 horror authors discuss monsters? It must be Wandering Monster. Roll initiative!
I feel like once you put the mask on it...
Once you put the mask on it, it's a monster.
Please rise for his dishonor. Judge of the abyss. Fetid pig at the table of suffering.
You brought the Whomping Willow. I brought a goddamn kaiju.
We'll see you every Monday.
This has been a presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.